Today we will talk about classification of bones depending upon their size and shape. This is the third most important classification of bones. According to this classification, we divide the bones into long bones, into long short bones, into short bones, into irregular bones, and into flat bones. So according to this classification, there are 5 classes of bones. First we will talk about the long bones. Long bones are those bones that typically have a shaft, which is the long central part, and they have 2 ends. These 2 ends are called epiphyses, and in between these two there is a transitional zone that we call metaphysis. Now the head or the base, both are called epiphysis. Then the shaft is also called as diaphysis, and in between them there is a metaphysis, which is the transitional zone. Long bones are the typical bones that you see drawn everywhere, and the typical example of these bones include bones of your arm, which is humerus, bone of forearm, which is radius and ulna, bones of leg or lower limb. In leg we have tibia and fibula, and in thigh you have the longest bone in the body, which is femur. So you must remember that the longest bone in the body, even amongst long bones, is the femur. You must also remember that long bones mostly produce bone marrow. They produce or they contain bone marrow. Now this bone marrow can be of 2 types. It can be red or yellow. The yellow one is inert and fatty, but the red one produces blood cells. All blood cells arise from bone marrow of these long bones and some other bones, and these are produced within the bone marrow. Bone marrow in a bone is found within the center. To further elaborate, a long bone typically, if you consider its shaft, this is the shaft of a long bone, okay, and the center of it there will be bone marrow. This is all bone marrow, okay, and this bone marrow is found within the shaft in the center, and this part of the bone is called medullary cavity. Now just next to that there is spongy bone on either side, and next to that we have a layer of compact bone on either side. Now what you need to remember is that the center of the bone has medullary cavity, which contains bone marrow, which might be inert, as in yellow or red, that causes hematopoiesis. In other terms, it produces all types of bone cells, blood cells. Then you have the spongy bone, and the spongy bone is lined by a layer of connective tissue, which is called the end ostium. Okay, so just next to the spongy bone it is covered on either side by endosteum, and the compact bone is covered by a similar layer of tissue, connective tissue, which is called periosteum. Now what these endosteum and periosteum do is that they serve to supply nerve and blood vessels to the bone so that the bone can grow. This is especially true for long bones. Now you can remember that this is the center or the shaft, and you can elongate it on either side, and this will become a typical bone. This is the epiphysis of the bone that I have drawn. Second category of bones that we are going to study are the long short bones. Now the long short bones, according to structure, they typically have a shaft and they are shorter in length than the long bones. They have two ends, but only one end is called epiphysis. Okay, so one of both the ends can be called epiphysis. Typical example of these bones include the metacarpal and the metatarsals. Metacarpals within the hand, metatarsals within the feet, and phalanges in both hand and feet. Okay, now what you need to remember is that when it comes to metacarpals and metatarsals, we have 5 of them in hand and feet. Each hand and foot we have 5 of the metacarpal and 5 of the metatarsals, right? But the base of first metacarpal or that of the first metatarsal is called epiphysis, whereas the head of rest, second, third and fourth, 2, 3, 4 and 5, right, they are called epiphysis in these cases. For example, this is my hand. Now first metatarsal is going to be present, metacarpal is present over here. The base of this, which is present over here, is going to be called as the epiphysis of this long short bone, and the heads which are present over here in my knuckles and of the rest of them, second, third, fourth and fifth, these are called the epiphysis of these bones, right? Third category of bones is called short bones, right? So it's very easy to remember how to classify them according to size and shape. We have the long bones, we have the long short bones, and we have the short bones so far. So the short bones are those bones that are typically much smaller in size, right? And they have various shapes, and a typical example of them are the carpal bones, which are 8 in each hand, or the tarsal bones, okay, which are 7 in each foot, okay, that form on the ankle joint. These are the typical example of short bones. Now we will move on to the fourth category, which is the flat bones. Now, as the name indicates, these bones are flattened. They are not elongated, they are not short or irregular, they are flattened from top to bottom, right? So their structure is made up of spongy bone, right? And on either side of spongy bone we have a layer of compact bone. Spongy bone is, so it forms a sandwich structure where there is spongy bone in the middle and compact on either side, and they are flattened from top to bottom. This spongy bone in this case is called dipley. You need to remember this, that the spongy bone in this case is called dipley. Typical example of these bones include scapula, which is your shoulder blade, which is present in the upper limb, right? Then your sternum, which is also called as the breastbone, your rib cage, and your skull bones or cavaleria, right? Skull bones, you need to remember, they are a very typical example of flat bones. Now the fifth and last category of bones is called irregular bones. Irregular bones are pretty easy. They are irregular in shape. They are so irregular that we cannot describe them as to we cannot put them in any of the above categories. A typical example of an irregular bone is a hip bone. Remember, when we did the classification based upon the axial and the appendicular skeleton, we studied that there are 2 hip bones in our body, but we will further study that each hip bone has further 3 bones or 3 partitions within it called pubis, ilium and ischium, right? Then your vertebrae, each vertebral body is actually different. The vertebral bodies in the cervical region are different from that in the lumbar, and those in the thoracic and those in the sacral and coccygeal region, they're all different, they look different. So they are so irregular that we give them into an irregular classification. Similarly, your mandible and maxilla within your head, your sphenoid bone within the head are examples of irregular bones. To sum up, we said that within the classification according to size and shape, we have long bones, short bones, flat bones and irregular bones. Long bones, you have a typical example of longest bone in the body, which is femur. Long short bones, you need to remember metacarpals and metatarsals. Short bones, you need to remember carpals and tarsals. Flat bones, always remember skull. And irregular bones, remember vertebral body and hip, etc.